Hello and welcome to this download from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is philosopher, broadcaster and journalist Julian Baggini, author of more than half a dozen works of popular philosophy, the best known of which is probably The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten, a collection of 100 thought experiments to kick-start philosophical thinking. That book was followed by The Duck That Won the Lottery, which takes apart 100 bad arguments and examples of faulty reasoning. And now Julian has published Should You Judge This Book by Its Cover, which examines 100 examples of proverbial wisdom and folk philosophy, of the sort which finds its way into innumerable everyday conversations. He sets out to ponder whether a bird in the hand really is worth two in the bush, whether there is no smoke without fire, whether beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and the road to hell paved with good intentions. I asked Julian if the new book was the final part of a triptych.
Yes, that's true. I mean, they're all actually quite different in what the focus is, but I suppose the thing that unifies them is that in each case you've got 100 quite short chapters, and they're all stimulants to further thinking. I often think a lot of the great things of philosophy are simply when someone comes along and enables you to perhaps see a distinction that you haven't noticed before, or to just observe that things don't have to be read one way, they can be read another. And there are 100 short attempts to do that, really.
And so why did you pick proverbs and bits of folk wisdom? What made you think there was something worth investigating from a philosophical point of view?
You just keep on noticing people say these things, people repeat them all the time. You know, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, and it's a very common thought that actually these proverbs and sayings contradict one another. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. It's never too late to learn. Which one of these is true? It seems they're always capturing a partial truth in some way. But they tend to get parroted and repeated so often. The idea I wanted to do was to try and really dig and see if anything interesting could be said about them. And of course, some there can't. Obviously in selecting the ones that I wrote about, I had to find ones where there was something interesting which was perhaps not obvious. I didn't want to just go around saying, here's an old proverb. When you think about it, not really true, is it? That wouldn't have been an interesting book.
I think it's quite interesting that you think about the context in which these are said. I mean, they could be offered as advice, or they could be offered as sort of retrospective justification for your actions. And I think it's quite an interesting way to open them up, rather than seeing if they're universal laws, which, as you say, they always aren't.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, all these things have a context, and I think that's the other sort of thing to think about. They're not all purpose. They don't just fit any situation. And so, when someone says one of these things and it seems the right thing to say, it's not because they contain a truth which always applies. It's because you've managed to find the right proverb that applies in that case. But I think, again, one of the problems is, though, that we tend to think they have more of a universal application, or they can be invoked in that way. I mean, for instance, the idea to forgive and forget is one which is often held up as this is just in general a good thing to do. And although I don't always go back to the origins, it was quite interesting that as a quotation it is in King Lear, and then the king is asking for that from the context of an old man who's near the end of life, who really there's nothing else to do but be compassionate in that situation. That's a very different situation, for example, to someone who's done you a wrong, who is perhaps in the middle of their life, and you've got to continue dealing with them in the future. So I think a lot of it is just thinking more carefully about in which context do these things apply.
Do you think, though, that they share at some level a similar impulse to rigorous philosophy, in that they are trying to interpret the world, to say things about the world which are true, to deduce laws about the world which hold? Or do you see them as a more debased sort of species?
I don't think they're a more debased species. I think that there's a kind of a symmetry here. A lot of what is, when you spread it out in its fullness, quite complicated philosophy, actually springs from a very straightforward insight which can be captured in just a sentence or so. In the same kind of way, I think a lot of proverbs are things which you put over in a sentence, but to fully understand them, you have to unpack them in broad ways. So I think there's this commonality there that you don't really understand them properly unless you can, in a sense, both see the essential elements, the boiled down version, but also see what happens when you unpack it.
At the end of each of the 100 entries in the book, you give compare and contrast, where you've got 3 other aphorisms, maybe drawn from a different tradition. What are you trying to do there?
Well, partly it's a bit of fun, actually. I think it's quite interesting to see how a lot of these proverbs, particularly the proverbs, come up in different versions in different languages. And sometimes it's just amusing to see how in a different culture the references are completely different. An equivalent to no smoke without fire, for instance, is supposedly a Polish proverb which says, where wood is being chopped, shavings fly, which, again, is kind of hard even to make sense of. But I think if you think of familiar ones, if you look at them, if you imagine what it would mean to read them not having come across them before, it wouldn't be obvious what their meaning was. But also, I think sometimes the point of the comparison is that there are slightly different versions, and often within the text I talk about things which are superficially quite similar, but perhaps have quite a different import, that subtle differences can actually make a big difference.
The Italian proverb, go to the square and ask advice, then go home and do what you like, seemed to me to sort of say something about a particular Mediterranean culture of the square and the home and the patriarch and so on. I mean, is that reading too much into it, or do you think you can sort of see national characteristics expressed in some of these proverbs?
Yeah, no, I think you can. I think that is a good example. Why is it that some cultures take as their focus the square, the house, or cheese and so forth? I mean, the examples that are chosen in a particular culture say something about that culture, and it's just quite a kind of nice way of just sort of reminding ourselves of these differences, at the same time seeing that obviously people have very similar thoughts in different cultures, but always coloured by those cultural influences.